Okay, so we're going to get started with more Rhino and VRay for today. Today we're going to shift a little bit, and I'll do this as we go forward. You've been learning a bunch of Rhino skills. Now we're going to drop in a day of VRay, and then we'll go back to do some more Rhino, and then we'll drop in a day of VRay. And this kind of mix seems to work really well for you guys learning both kind of simultaneously. I've tried the course where I do all the Rhino first, and then we do VRay, and we get bogged down in VRay for too long. So little bits of VRay give you just the taste of what you need as you go forward, and then toward the end of the semester is where we'll spend more time in VRay when we're setting up environments, and it gets a little bit more complicated. But for right now, we do need an introduction to VRay because we do need to be able to make some nice decisions about materials and that sort of thing, because that's very much part of the stuff that we're building. So today I'm going to go ahead and open up Rhino, just as we've normally done. And I'm going to create a brand new large object inches file. If you go to the new tab, it's available there under templates to get started. If you didn't, you just want to make sure that you are in inches when you create your new file. And there we go. And hopefully you have your VRay toolbars still showing. The idea of getting those showing was that when you start up your computer, they should be there. Hopefully the computers stay the way they're supposed to and you have it. If not, you will need to load those VRay toolbars because we're going to need those for what we're doing today. So the first thing that I'm asking you to do in part one, and I'm going to walk through all the steps of the various things that we're going to be doing today live, and then you guys will have time to go through and do them all. If you try to do it while I'm doing it, you may get lost along the way, in which case we'll get you caught up eventually. But what I want you to start with is creating a simple composition of 5 solid objects. And it doesn't matter what they look like. We're going to use these objects to apply materials. And so I'll start with a box, and somewhere over here, maybe I'll draw a little box. And it really doesn't even matter what size these objects are, because the stuff we're applying is just not that big. But for scale purposes, I don't know, let's make the box 4 feet by 4 feet by 4 feet. Oops. 4 feet by 4 feet by 4 feet. So my original box was a little bit large. That gives me a sense for what general scale would be. And then we'll create some other fun objects. Let's see, what else do we have here? How about a cylinder? That looks fun. We'll do a little cylinder there. And these are, again, under the solid primitives. We can do a pyramid. Why not? That could be entertaining. And let's see here. Let's do a sphere. And everybody likes a donut, right? Let's throw a donut in there. That was not what I wanted. Try that one more time. There we go. And just for fun, I'm going to flip this up so that it's on its side. There we go. I'm going to make a few adjustments to the sphere and the donut so that they end up a little bit higher. I'll drop them up like that. Move them over a bit. You know what, this really needs to go there. I'm just composing these slightly. It's okay if the objects intersect a bit, something like that. Essentially, I just want some objects that are there. I want 5 of them. And now that we've established those 5 objects, it's time to start kind of diving into VRay and materials. And VRay sometimes seems simple, and other times seems ridiculously complicated. And the truth is, it is ridiculously complicated most of the time. I try really hard to script as much as possible in the stuff that you're using. Furthermore, I'm going to give you files long term that will allow you to load presets so that I've gone through and made all the corrections for you so you don't have to do too much. But in the beginning, it's important for you to at least be aware of the interface and understand how VRay really works. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to follow along with the VRay 8.1, which is the global switches setup. Which you can obviously view here. I'm going to walk through it live so that you guys can see the example. But essentially, before we get started, we need to set up some basic parameters in VRay. The good news is most of the defaults are just fine, and so we can move on with that. So in the VRay toolbars, there's a little yellow tag looking thing with an O on it. That's the VRay options dialog box. And that then opens up this VRay option editor box, which by itself doesn't look too daunting. Seems reasonable until you start opening the drawers. So we're going to open up global switches to start, and we get these options. But you can see rather quickly that if I opened up switches and camera and environment and I start to open these up, you can see that I have scrolling after scrolling after scrolling of little checkboxes and options and numbers and stuff that means nothing to you. Yeah? It's right here under VRay options. It's the O. It's a little tag. If you don't have the VRay toolbar loaded, it would be a good idea to load it. Otherwise, in the time being, you can go to the VRay menu and click on options. If you're not seeing the VRay menu, then VRay is not set as your default rendering engine. So you would have to go to Render, Current Renderer, and make sure VRay is set as the default. Okay? So now that I have this up, I'm going to go ahead and close up these drawers. I open those just so that you can see that there are lots and lots and lots of little tiny options that are available within VRay, which is part of why it's such a good rendering engine. So let me close all these guys down, because I don't need them open. We're going to start with just the global switches option. And like I said, we can save these presets so that they're easier to load in the future. But for right now, we're going to go through the global switches. So as we come down here, the geometry switches are fine. When we get to lighting here, you can see that we can turn on and turn off whether we want the lights to show or not. And so in our case, we do want the lights to show, so we'll leave that box checked. The other thing is hidden lights. I like to leave hidden lights off, because if I have lights on a layer and I turn them off, if I turn the layer off and they become hidden, I don't want the lights on anymore. It's a way of turning the lights off. So it seems logical to me to leave those off. You can override, and if you have lights on hidden layers, you can manually turn them on by clicking this box, and then all lights will show. We do, of course, want to cast shadows, so that should be on. This show GI only refers to something called global illumination. And so in the context of an environment, we're sitting here in this classroom right now. We have many light sources. We have light that is coming from the lights that are above us. Obviously, they're in the back. We have light coming from the sun outside. Those are actual lights. They're light sources. So they would be referred to here under lights. We would mimic the sun. We would mimic those lights. Then there's another thing that's called global illumination, or GI. And this global illumination is just general ambient light. It's reflected light. So it comes from some source, but it gets reflected and bounced a number of times, and it's just kind of general lighting. So this global illumination light, we can turn off the sun and the lights that are in a room and just have a kind of a temporary global illumination. It's just kind of universal light. We don't want that on. We want to make sure that's unchecked because we want actual light sources to cast our shadows. So that's good. So we've gone through this lighting little sub box here. As we come down here, there's a few. The indirect illumination we'll leave unchecked. Low thread priority should be checked. That just helps our rendering a little bit. Progress render is always nice to see. We're not worrying about batch rendering. On the right side of this global switches, we have our materials options. So number one, do we want the materials to be able to reflect light or not? We can turn that on or turn that off. Generally speaking, some materials have reflection to them, so we'd like to leave that on so we can see it. We're not going to worry too much about the individual settings here. We do want our maps, our filter maps for GI. All of these essentially need to be on. This override materials. If you are having trouble with your materials, I will do this toward the end of the semester. You'll see me do this occasionally. You're having trouble with a rendering, something's hanging and you can't figure out what's going on. You can override all the materials with another material. You could essentially say, make everything gray and see what happens. And sometimes that's useful. For right now, we're going to leave that unchecked because we're not trying to override the materials. And the secondary ray bias is fine at 0.001. So that runs us through the global switches. I didn't really change anything, but I like to at least introduce the concept of what the global switches are and what the basic options are within the global switches. So I can go ahead and close this now. And we're going to move on to continuing to set up this file to get ready to render. So the next thing that we want, I'm going to follow VRay 8.5 to create an infinite plane. I don't need to actually go do it. I'm just going to do it for you. What I'll do is I want to look quickly at my layers here. And instead of using the default layer, I'm going to use layer 2. So I'll double click on layer 2 to change the little check mark next to it. And I'm also going to rename layer 2 to be IP for infinite plane. Actually, since it's today and we haven't done this before, I'll just call it an infinite plane for you. So I have infinite plane there. And to create the VRay infinite plane, I'm going to use the VRay toolbars right here. And it's next to the render buttons, next to the two blue spheres. There's a kind of a diagonal plane with arrows going off to either side. And it's as simple as clicking that. And you see that now I have this plane that goes off theoretically to infinity, to the horizon line of my view. It's acting as ground. I'm giving it a temporary ground. If I were to zoom out or to look at it in the top view, we'd see my objects are right there. And this plane is represented by a square. It is not this square. It's not just a very large rectangle. It actually is infinite. It goes off into space. But this is the representation of it in Rhino. So it's designed to become the ground in our particular file. It's always a good idea to put the infinite plane on its own layer. Eventually, we'll create an environment layer, and then it'll be a sublayer of environment. But for right now, we'll leave it as infinite plane because I'll switch back to default here as my current layer. Because afterward, we can choose infinite plane, and then we can choose the little lock icon, which will allow us to select our objects without selecting and moving the infinite plane. It's very easy if you don't lock the infinite plane layer to move the infinite plane around instead of moving your objects. If you're not seeing the infinite plane, it's possible you're in wireframe mode, in which case it would look like this. So you might need to switch your view into shaded mode so you can see it as shaded objects. So now we have ground, essentially an infinite plane as our ground. We also need some kind of a light that's inside this scene. And we're going to use something called a basic directional light to provide some illumination. There are lots of different kinds of lights that we'll put in. There'll be point lights and spotlights, and we'll do a sun eventually, etc. Those will happen in the 220s, 223, 224, 225 lectures. So we've got a long way to go before we get there. But for right now, we're going to use just a basic directional light. And in order to set that up, I want to work on yet another layer, again, so we can turn the light on and off. So I'm going to work on layer 3 here. So I'll double click so that it becomes the current layer. It has a check mark next to it. And I will rename layer 3 to be directional light. Okay, so now I have a directional light layer, and that layer is my current layer. So when I create the directional light, it's going to go onto that layer, which is obviously the point. So in this context, I'm going to zoom back out a little bit and look down. I would like the light to come from like kind of this side and shine down toward my objects, casting a shadow over here. So creating the directional light is very challenging without a helper object because it's in 3 dimensions. And you can do it, and certainly I could do it using all 3 views at once, but it can be challenging. So instead, I'm going to have you use a helper object. And what we'll do is we'll create a box over here, something like that. I'll then click on the directional light button. So here's the tricky one. Rhino and VRay love to play tricks on us, right? So right next to, we have our lights going across here. There's an invisible button right at the end. Gotta love it, right? That is the directional light that we want. Okay, so it's not there, see? Ooh, it's invisible. Okay, so we're going to use that one. So click on the invisible button. We could also type in directional light. That would get us there as well. And what we're going to do is it's asking us the end of the light direction vector. So that essentially is, what is the direction this light is pointing? So we're going to pick this lower corner of the box right there. Then it's going to say, what's the start of the light direction vector? I'm going to pick the opposite corner of the box. So I'm going up above to right there. And essentially now we have this little light, let me highlight it in yellow, pointing down on a diagonal. If I were doing this without the helper object, just for clarity purposes, and I pick directional light, I'd say, OK, I want the end to end there. But it's hard to get this to go up in its 3rd dimension. So I could move it up in the 3rd dimension in one of the side views. Let me turn off ortho for just a second. So I'm moving it up in one of the side views like that. But it's still hard to actually control exactly where this is happening in space. So see how that's now pointing down? I wanted it to point the other way. I could then take this and I could rotate it. Oops. so that it's shining down, something like that, and I could eventually get there. But it's hard. In the case of the box, it's really easy. You just go from one corner of the box to the other corner of the box, and you get that little line for us. So now I have a directional light. I've deleted the box that created the directional light in the first place. It does not matter for this light how far away it is from our objects. Essentially, this is just a representation that we have a plane of light, infinite in direction, shining in one direction on all our objects. Okay? So now I have a light that's been established on this little scene, shining down and away toward us, which is perfect. Now I need to set up kind of a view that I'm going to enjoy looking at as part of my render. Okay, so I want to kind of zoom in a little bit, and we'll pick something along those lines. I like perspective views. I like to kind of see the horizon line out there. And this feels like a pretty good position for me to go ahead and do a rendering. If your view looks a little bit different, it's not the end of the world. I'm going to go in and use, we're going to jump way ahead to Rhino 5.28 for saved views. This is just so that I can come back to this view over and over again. I'm going to render this many, many times over the course of the day. So what I will do to do this is I'll come up to this little triangle next to where it says perspective, and I'm going to go down to set view named views. And when I do set view named views, I get the named view dialog box here. There's a little disk icon that says save, and I can now save this view as, we'll call it render 01, and I'll say OK. Does this really matter for what we're doing today? Not at all. But when you get, let's fast forward ahead. You guys are all working really hard in Rhino. You're really good. We get to the final, and you're starting to set up your interior night rendering or whatever. You're going to have to go through and double check the rendering. You'll do preview renderings many, many times before you do the final rendering. It's the nature of doing lighting. You're adjusting settings and getting that perfect rendering. You want to be able to move around, adjust objects, and then go right back to that perfect view that you've set up with good composition and whatever. If you save the view, it's really easy to jump back to that view. And I'll show you how that happens. So let's say I moved around and I wanted to adjust these objects or whatever. I can simply go back to the triangle, go down to set view, and right there at the bottom of my list is render 1. I can go right back to that view again. So it's like a saved scene in SketchUp if you've done a saved scene in SketchUp. Same thing. We set that up for ourselves so we can go back to it. OK, there's one other part in this that I didn't assign, that I didn't actually write in here that I should have. And that is that right now the background would show up as black. So let me do a test render and I'll show you. So I'll click on the little R for render. And we'll get a little window that pops up. And we see that, number 1, all of my objects are white, because I haven't assigned any materials. But 2, the background here is black, which is not very attractive just yet. Long term, we'll get into putting skies and stuff in the background. But for right now, we just want it to be that infinite white space. Okay, you guys remember back to the I'm a Mac, I'm a PC commercials, right, with the 2 guys standing there with just the white background? That's essentially what we're doing, the all white background. So I'm going to go into my VRay options, and I apologize, I didn't actually write this into the handout. I missed it. It was an oversight on my part. And I'm going to open up the Environment tab. So I've closed Global Switches by clicking on it. I'm going to come down to Environment. It's the fourth tab down. And we have something called Background right here. Reflection, Refraction, Background. You see that it's black right now. I'm going to click where it's black, and I'm going to change it to be white. Easy. So it was black. It's now white. If I go back and render again, you'll see that the sky is now white. Exactly what I want. The other thing that happened is, based on my view, I'm getting clipping on my objects. This is optional. But I'm going to click on the Output tab, a little bit further down, Output. And I'm going to uncheck Override Viewport. And then when I do my rendering, oops, never mind, wrong thing. I'm going to leave Override Viewport, but I'm going to get the View Aspect ratio. There we go. That's what I wanted. Sorry. Get View Aspect. I'm going to click that button. And now when I render, exactly what I see is what I get. My rendering's a little bit wider. OK, so still, we're not seeing much. We see a little bit of shadow down here. That's it. We need to get into actually assigning some materials. But before we do that, just in case things go wrong, let's save the file. So I'll go to File and then Save. and we'll put it into today's exercise here. We're in 204. Let me create a new folder really quick. There we go, and we'll save that. VRay loves to crash. The good news is VRay runs completely independent of Rhino. So if VRay happens to crash, no big deal. You save your Rhino file, close Rhino, open Rhino, get VRay back. Okay? It's just part of VRay. And I wish that it weren't that way, but it will happen to all of you. Yeah?
How do you make the sphere to be on the surface instead of...
I looked, yeah, if I want the sphere to sit up on the surface a little bit, all I did was I looked in one of my side views, and I pulled it up above that ground plane. So let me move back to the render view, and now we're going to actually get into some materials. So the tutorials I'm referencing are all listed on the sheet, but essentially the first thing is that I'm going to create a basic material for an object. So I'll start with maybe the pyramid as an object. I'm going to click on my VRay material editor, this yellow sphere with an M on it, and that brings up the VRay material editor. By default, the VRay material editor goes on top of everything else in this corner. Pull it down so it's in the middle of the screen. It'll help you long term. OK, so now I need to create a material. And to create that material, I'm going to right-click where it says Scene Materials here. And there'll be Create Material from the little drop-down menu. And I'm going to create a standard material. When I create that standard material, it will be called default material. I don't know why I have these other materials in here. Let me get rid of these. I don't want you guys to be confused. OK, so there is default material. I'm going to rename this default material. If I right-click on it, I can say Rename Material, and I'm going to call this Red. And I'll say OK. If I were to click on the Preview button here, I get a preview of what the material looks like against this checkered background. Obviously, the material is not red yet, so we need to make that correction. So I see the material there. Stay away from this Live Update checkbox. In an ideal world with a really powerful computer, you can click on Live Update, and then it will update as you make changes. These guys, as nice as they are or were, they don't really like it very much. They get cranky if we do that. So just stay away from that. If you want to see a preview, click the Preview button and let it do it instead of trying to ask it to do it live while you do it. So this is set up very much like the VRay options. This is kind of how VRay works. It has all these little drawers. So if we look at our standard red material here, we have 3 drawers: diffuse, options, and maps. We're going to work with just the diffuse for right now. Diffuse essentially means color, or image in the case of an image. And we're going to change the color, which is listed right here as color, to red. So I'll click on where it is gray, and I'll change it to red. And I'll say OK. If you don't like the red that comes up as red, you can scroll down and pick one of these other bunch of different colors. You could also type in an actual red value. So if you had a red that you liked, you could type in the RGB value. And that would then customize it. You can also drag your little cursor somewhere in the middle of this red and pick the red that you like, whatever that red might be. Okay? And for the context of today, it makes no difference what colors you choose. We're just going through and we're playing around with options so you can learn this. If I were to click on the Preview button, you can now see that what was gray is now red, which is good. So I want to take this red and I want to assign it to the pyramid. So I have the pyramid selected in the background. And notice that while this dialog box is open, I can still work in Rhino. It's running independently. So it's not locking me out of Rhino. So I can select this pyramid, and then I can right-click on where it says red and say Apply Material to Selection. So I'll apply it to the selection, and it will then be on that object. Now, it's a little confusing for those of you that haven't worked in here before, because I did it, and it didn't change the color. It didn't do anything. Okay? That's because we're in what's called shaded mode, which shows us the surfaces, but it doesn't show us what the rendering is going to look like. So we can actually switch from shaded mode into rendered mode, which will give us a rendered preview. So now you can see that it's saying that this object is going to be red. I would like to caution you about rendered mode, and that is that it rarely looks exactly like it's going to render. So it's a preview, not what it actually looks like. Okay? So I'm going to leave it in rendered mode for right now. The other thing about rendered mode, though, is all your lines go away. So let's say I was in shaded mode, and I had a line that was drawn. I'm just drawing some lines, okay? So this line then is there. You guys all see it, right? When I switch to my rendered mode, oh, it kept the line. Usually the line disappears. Anyway, must have been an update. All right, so I'll leave it on my rendered mode. I'm going to open up my material library again. And again, I'm going to drag this to the middle. And now it's time to create another material. So I'll right-click, and I'll say Create Material, and we'll go to Standard. And let's call this one blue. And I'll say OK. And I'm going to change the color of this material to be blue, or maybe dark blue if I feel like it. And I'll say OK. Then I'll do the same thing and apply this to one of my objects. I'll right-click on blue and say Apply Material to Selection. And now that one is blue. We're going to do this for each of these 3 objects. So we're going to, again, a lot of learning is repetition, so we're doing it multiple times. So for each of these objects, I'm going to create another material. So I'll go back to my material editor, right-click, Create Material. We'll do Standard. Let's do this one as Violet. Why not? Let me rename it as Violet. And we will apply material to selection there. And we'll create a couple more. Let's go Create Material, Standard. And this time maybe I'll do green. We'll call this green. And let me go ahead and apply it. Apply material to selection. There it is. And one more. Right-click, Create Material, Standard. Maybe we'll do orange this time. We rename it as orange. I'll select this object, right-click, and say Apply Material to Selection. So now I have 5 different color or 5 different materials that have been assigned to each of those 5 objects. At this point, it's time to start an actual rendering. So I'll come up to the Render button here, and I'll click on the R for Render. And I will then get a rendering out of VRay, which you see here. So this rendering looks better than the previewed render. You can see that it's different. The shadows are a little bit more subtle, but there it is. I'm getting my nice rendering here of my shapes. I need to go ahead and save this because I'm going to post this along with a bunch of other images today. So I'll click on the Save icon, which is right here. And I want it to go onto my flash drive into today's folder. There we go. And so this is exercise 204, fall 2017. And we'll do 01. And I'll go ahead and click Save. So this is the first rendering that I've created. We can increase the size of this rendering so that we don't have this blurring along the edges and whatever. But for the stuff that we're creating today, this size is just fine. The other thing that you'll notice is that the renderings are happening fairly quickly in the beginning. As we make these materials more complex, the renderings start to slow down and take more computing power. OK, so we've worked through and we've created these basic materials. We're going to move on to step 8 in part 2, which is we're going to adjust the transparency of 2 of the objects. So at this point, it's really independent of the objects. The materials have already been assigned to the objects, so editing the material will automatically apply it to the object. So I don't ever have to reapply a material. It's already been applied to the object. So let me go back to my VRay material editor, so the M icon here. And I'm going to pick 2 of the materials. Since they're in front, I'll do the violet and the green as my transparent ones. So let's start with green. I'll select it from the list. And here under diffuse, we've already done color, which is green. But over here in transparency, we're going to adjust this color. So what transparency does is essentially we have two values and a bunch of grays in between. Black is completely solid. White is 100% transparent. We'll see nothing. So if we pick some value of gray in there, we will get the object somewhat transparent. So let's go ahead and click on the black square next to transparency, and let's pick dark gray. And I'll go ahead and say OK. And if we were to preview our green, we see that it's somewhat transparent. See that we're seeing through it just a little bit? Let's pick the violet object and do the same thing with the transparency, only this time, instead of picking dark gray, let's just pick medium gray. And we'll say OK. And if we preview it, it's even more transparent. And we can see it down here in the previews. So if I were to pick this even lighter, light gray, for example, and I preview it, see how more and more of the object goes away? It's more and more transparent. So in our case, so that we can see it, I'm going to stick with dark gray and gray. There are, of course, if we scroll down here, a very large number of shades of gray that we can pick if we want to fine-tune how transparent it really is. But we'll use the basics for right now. So there it is. It's a little bit more solid. Perfect. Let's go ahead and do a rendering. So now that I've adjusted those two materials, we'll go through and we'll do a rendering. So the rendering takes a little bit longer because now we have transparency involved. And so as we look at this object, we can see that we can see through this and see the object that's behind. We can see through this object and see the object that's behind. Because of how bright the background is, we're seeing almost completely through that section. But we're seeing a little bit against there. There's lots of oh, there aren't any reflections yet. So it's just shadows at this point. So let me go ahead and save this one. This was my next version. So I'll click on Save. This will be number 02. And I'll click Save. Now we're going to move on and we're going to deal with reflections. So we did transparency first. We're going to move on to reflections, which is VRay 8.4. That'll talk about reflection layers. And I'm going to go into my VRay material editor, and we're going to add some reflections to these objects. So the first one I'm going to do is I'm going to use the green one again. And we're going to add some reflection to the green. So I'll click on green, and we see in the preview right now that there is no reflection. It's just kind of like a green blob. I'm going to right-click on green, and I'm going to go into Create Layer, and I'm going to choose Reflection from this layer. So I'll click and I'll choose Reflection. And you notice that now I have something on top of diffuse. So before I only had diffuse, options, and maps. Now I have something for reflection. We also see in the live preview down here that suddenly we're getting some little spots from my light, and it's starting to shine a little bit. If we look at the preview here, we can see that it's becoming shiny. Yeah. You have to right-click on the name of the layer and say Create Layer, Reflection. So now that one has a little bit of reflection to it, and I'm going to leave the reflection at its default value. Let's pick another color. Let's do maybe, let's do the blue. And I'm going to add a reflection layer to that. I'll right-click, Create Layer, Reflection. If we were to preview it, we'd see it. But I'm going to make some adjustments to the reflection itself. And so if I open up the reflection drawer here, you can see that I have a bunch of options that relate to this particular reflection. Under General, if I click on this blue button that has a capital M on it, I can go in and I can actually change something called the IOR, or the index of refraction, for this reflection. And essentially, materials that exist in space, in our world, have a reflection value associated with them. And that is this index of refraction. If you do a Google search for a specific type of material and what the IOR should be, or the index of refraction should be, you can actually find out what that is. So diamonds, for example, have a higher IOR value. They tend to reflect more than glass, for example. So the default, which I believe is close to glass, is 1.55. If I wanted to make this shinier, so to speak, more reflective, I could increase this value. Chrome is about 8. If a chrome plated something is about 8, a mirror or something. So we can increase that value. Maybe let's do 4, for example. And I'll go ahead and say OK. And if we click on preview, you see how much brighter the reflection gets. So it's still a blue object, but it's a very shiny blue object. So that's going to change. So a lot of this is experimentation. So you can play around. If you want to do another object, I say only do 2, but you could pick another one. If I wanted the orange object to have some reflection, same thing. Right-click on orange, create layer, reflection, and maybe this time I change that IOR value down. Maybe I do it at 0.75, for example. And in this case, there's some reflection on it, but it's not too strong. So something like the plastic monitors that are here, right? These happen to have a little texture on them too, but they do reflect some light. They're not completely matte. They have a little bit of reflection to it. So something like this might be that little bit of reflection. So now that I've done that, let's come back and do another render. So I'll click on the R button for render. Notice that the render time slows down. We add these reflections in. The way that VRay works is it actually calculates 8 or more bounces of light. So if my original light hits this blue transparent object, it will then reflect against the violet transparent object, then reflects against the blue, then it reflects back to the violet, then you get the idea. At least 8 bounces. That's how it traces light. So we get this view, and it obviously looks a lot different than the last version. It's much shinier. The reason that we get some of these weird lines is because we have no clouds or anything in the sky. If I had clouds or sky, we'd get reflection of sky, which is what we typically see in an object. But we have a complete white background, so things like glass won't really look that good. So for right now, I suggest you stay away from glass. When we get to loading in materials, don't load glass yet. It's not useful yet. OK. So I'm going to go ahead and save this as number 3. And I'll click Save. And there we go. Now I'm going to go back into some of these and make a few further modifications. So I'll go into my VRay material editor here. And let's go back to that green material. Just making sure. Oh, actually, I'm looking back at step 9. I said to add the reflection to 4 of the layers. So you can add more reflections. OK, so I'm going to move on and change the reflection glossiness down to 0.5. So if I come down here under reflection, there's glossiness. The reflection glossiness right here, I'll say is 0.5. And when I make that change and I preview it, we can see that it's much less reflective than it was. So it's not as shiny. We can move on. When we can do one at 0.75, let's do the red. I don't have a reflection on this, so let's create one. Create layer, reflection. And our glossiness, I'll do 0.75. Oops. And I'll click preview. Part of the reason that I'm going through, see how it's not as sharp anymore? So if I take that back to 1, preview. See how I can see right here? It's a nice sharp reflection of the light source. When I take the glossiness here to 0.75, it blurs the reflection. So it's as if there's a little bit of texture on the surface. So you can see just in going through these basic options how complex materials can be. Imagine the plastic of your computer monitor right now. If we were going to render that piece of plastic, there's a lot of complexity. Sure, we have to get the color. It's kind of this blackish gray color. But we also have to get how it should reflect light. We have to think through that. So in all of this, I want you to appreciate the fact that a lot of the materials that are really good that are out there that you can use have a lot of science behind why they work and why they look good. The better the quality of the material, the better and more accurate the rendering is going to look. Okay? So I'm going to go ahead and save this one last rendering. So I'll click on Render one more time. There we go. I'll click Save. And this will be number 4. Perfect. Now I'm going to go through, and yes, we just talked about how you would actually create materials from scratch. But now I'm going to go through and show you how to load in materials that pre-exist. Now here's a perfect example. I told you VRay loves to crash. So here's VRay. Everything gets grayed out, and you can't do anything with it anymore. Okay, that's a VRay crash. Sometimes if you leave it for 30 seconds or a minute, it'll come back. Sometimes it won't. If it doesn't come back and is locked out, go to File, save your Rhino file, close Rhino, and then open Rhino again, and you'll have VRay back. I don't write the program, okay, but this is just something that happens. Let me go ahead and open that back up. The good news is it doesn't crash your Rhino file. Your Rhino file is just fine, and all your settings are just fine. There it is. We're back. Okay? So now we've done all this work to create these materials. You have an appreciation for what goes into creating a good material. Now I'm going to have and show you how to load in materials. And we'll get to creating materials completely from scratch based on something that you want. But for right now, if you go to the course website, if you go under Resources and you scroll down to Downloadable Resource Packages, if we move to the Archie 136 section down here, you'll see that there's a link to download a zip archive of VRay materials. If you click on this, it will take you to a Dropbox site. You do not have to sign up for Dropbox. I'm just using them to host this because it's a big chunk of data. You can say no thanks, continue to view, and it will then open up this zip file where you can download it. Click the download button here. You don't need to save it to your Dropbox. You just download it directly, and it's going to start downloading this file. I think the zip file is 120 megabytes or something. So it's going to take a little bit of time for it to come down. Once it downloads all the way, you will have this zip file of all your materials. What I want you to do is I want you to extract that zip file, and it's going to take me forever for it to download, so I'm not going to actually demo this, but you're going to extract that zip file onto your flash drive. The hope is, for you guys, that you will put it in a folder called Resources, which I have here, and then there should be something called VRay, and then here we are with our VRay materials. I have a few other things because I create materials and whatever, but for your purposes, you should have a folder called VRay Materials. Hopefully it is in a Resources folder. Organization here is key. If you keep your stuff organized, it'll help you long term. If I open up VRay Materials, I have things ranging from art to landscape to glass to flooring, porcelain, roof, siding. I mean, there's tons of different materials that have all been created that you can then work with. Okay? So you need that downloaded. They absolutely have to be extracted out of the zip file. If you have the zip file, it's not good enough. You have to break that out. Yeah? Go through this again? Sure. So on the course website, under Resources, we're going to go to the Downloadable Resource Packages. Scroll down here to the Download Zip Archive of VRay Materials. This is a base set of materials that I'm giving you with a bunch of stuff in it to help you out. You will, of course, create more of your own, browse for more online, depending on what your needs are. Okay? When you download that, or when you click on that, it will take you to a Dropbox site. You can then click on the download button to download the file itself. And my file is still only at 86 megabytes, so it takes a little bit of time for this to happen. Okay? We need to make sure that we extract that file onto your flash drive, hopefully in a resources folder so you're organized. Okay? And then you have all of these subfolders with lots and lots of different materials that are part of it. No, I don't think they'll work in Revit file. They're different materials. This is just for VRay. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and switch back over into Rhino. I'm going to go to my material editor again, where we created the blue, the green, the red, etc. This time, instead of creating a material, I'm going to click on Scene Materials, then right-click and go to Load Material. And so when I click on Load Material, it's looking for a file called a vismat. And a vismat is a VRay material file. And so I'm going to go in and go to my flash drive and into my resources folder, into VRay materials, and I'm going to pick some material. So let's do wood, for example, and I'll pick a fir. Okay? I'm looking for this vismat. So this is wood fir vertical grain.vismat. Okay, that's just the name of it. And when I click open, it then loads. Here's wood fir, and there it is. Okay? There are files associated, and we'll explain what this is. There are files that go with this wood file. There's an image file, there's a texture file, there's a bunch of stuff that goes with it. So you have to have the whole material archive. You can't just have the vismat because there's related files. I can then take this wood and apply it to a material or to an object in my scene. So there it is. There's that one in front. Let me apply the material to selection, and now that object becomes a wood block. Let me load up some more. I'll right-click on Scene Materials. I'll go to Load Material. I'll go into VRay. Remember, I told you stay away from glass. Glass won't turn out. I promise you it won't turn out. Okay? So stay away from glass, but any of the rest of these are fair game. Trying to think. Let's go to porcelain. Let's do an orange porcelain. Why not? Okay, so there's porcelain orange. If I were to preview it, there it is. I can select an object. I can right-click and say Apply Material to Selection, and I can apply that to the object. Let me go ahead and load a few more. I'm going to load 5 total, so let me load material. Let's go into metal for fun. Let's go into gold. Why not? And let's load up gold. And let's make this cylinder in the back gold. So I'll right-click on gold and say Apply Material to Selection. Now notice when I have gold here as a material, things like the reflection have all been assigned. Somebody went through and created this material and assigned various values for what they needed to be. So I have gold. Let me go in. Let me load material. Sure, we'll do a fabric one. Let me apply that to the sphere. And let me load in one more.
Can we add the materials to this one?
I'm sorry, what?
Can we add different materials to the shapes that we have?
Yeah, you pick whatever materials you want. Just don't use glass, because the glass won't turn out. There's gravel. Let me apply it to this last one. Apply material to selection. Okay, it's entirely up to you. Now, in all likelihood, some of these are going to look better than others when you go to render them or when they're applied. I put the gravel on the donut, which really doesn't work. I probably should find something that looks more donut-like or whatever. But you guys get the idea. Play around with it. This is meant for you to have fun. When we do the rendering, we'll go ahead and click on the render button and do this final rendering. Chances are this will go even a little bit slower than anything you've had so far because it has more complex materials applied to it. And we'll let that render out. So if your patterns don't look particularly good on your objects, or they look too large or whatever, that's understandable. It's something called texture mapping that will fix that problem, but we're not covering texture mapping quite yet. That'll be the next little VRay module that we have. We'll talk about how to make the texture look good on your particular object. So when I'm done, I'll click the Save button, and this is once again going to go into my flash drive, into today's folder. I thought it was. Did I go back? Maybe I put the other ones in the 2016? Yeah, you're right. Thank you. Shows you how much attention I was paying to that today. All right, so there's that one. That one's saved in. Okay, perfect. After this is done, I'm going to go back to that file we created last class, my building. So we'll go ahead and save that. And I'm going to open up that file right here. And I'll try to apply a material to this object. And if you want to differentiate, if you created a little trim around your windows and you want to put different material on those trim pieces, that's fine. Depends on how far you went. At least all of those need to have a material assigned to them, so we'll load it the same way. This is kind of a way of double checking. I'm not going to do it live. You're going to do it. Okay? Remember also, though, that you need to create the infinite plane so that there's ground. And remember, you need the directional light. Right? So those are all little pieces, so this is kind of testing you at the end to see if you were able to follow through with all the stuff that I asked you to do. When it's all said and done, you're going to create a post that is a gallery post. If you guys were in 135, you remember creating these. It's because there's a fair number of images. We're going to go ahead and go to the Digital Tools site and create a new post. And these instructions are on the back of your handout, so if you haven't done it before, no big. This is exercise 204. I'm going to scroll down here, and I'm going to check the box for assignment or exercise 204. I'm going to change the format of the post to be gallery instead, which allows me to turn on the slideshow right there. I'll come up to the Gallery tab and say Insert Gallery or Add Images. I'll select Files. There they are. I'll hold down Shift and I'll select all of them. I'll click Open. And these should upload really quick because they're small files. When I'm done, I'll click Save All Changes. There it is. I've got them all. I'll scroll down to the very bottom and set a featured image. These images were already uploaded to the post, so I can filter by uploaded to the post and see just the ones that I just uploaded. I'm supposed to be able to do that. There we go. And I'll pick the one that I like the best, and I'll say Set Featured Image. Perfect. So now I have the featured image. I've categorized it. I have a gallery, and I'll go ahead and click on Publish. Now that it's published, I can view the post to confirm that it did load correctly. And there it is. There's my little slideshow with all of my various images. I don't care so much about the order. I just want those images and the steps along the way. So don't forget to save your steps along the way. And then have fun when you load in other materials. See how they load and that sort of thing. I want you to get familiar with this so that you feel comfortable bringing in materials. I'm going to assume as we move forward that you're comfortable bringing in materials. So today's your chance to get comfortable with that. Are there any questions? No? Yeah.
The house, so we have to do the same thing for the house.
Right.
Without the roof.
Right. The one that we created last class without the roof, the walls, you need to apply a material, you need to put an infinite plane underneath it, and you need to put a directional light in. So all the things that we did on this file, you're going to do to that file. It's a way of me double checking what you've done and that you know it. Okay? You'll upload that too. So you'll have the one image of the house. You only need to do one image of the house though. Another question? Okay, I'll come and help you.